all these things were public out there.
He just tweets. His thumbs are always active. Hello, team, and welcome to Bureaucracy. I'm your host, Emily Gross. I'm very excited because I have William Wechsler with me, who is the Senior Director at the Rafik Hariri Center at Middle East Programs at the Atlantic Council. I'm very happy to have you. And we're going to be talking a lot about the updates that have been going on with Iran and the U.S.'s decision to bomb Iran and the ceasefire between Iran and Israel and where all these countries are mingling and how things stand. So, William, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you very much for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
So before we begin, what are we drinking?
We're drinking Diet Coke. It's a very high alcohol version of Diet Coke.
Yes. Diet Coke, necessary, very necessary. So I have a beer. I have a Voodoo Imperial IPA, Voodoo Ranger, or chose it because talking about military. However, I am fundamentally incapable of getting the top off with my can opener. So it's going to be here for show, but we're not drinking at the moment, purely just because I am an imbecile. But before we begin, the question I always love to ask my guests is, why should we trust what you have to say?
Well, at one level, you shouldn't trust what anybody has to say. You should be, looking at what they say skeptically. And I hope that I pass the bar of skepticism, because I have been running the Rafik Hariri Center Middle East Programs at the Atlantic Council for over 7 years now, which the Atlantic Council is one of the largest and most impactful think tanks on national security in town in Washington, D.C. Our Middle East Programs is one of the largest Middle East programs in town. And I came to this after having a career in government, which included time throughout the Clinton administration and the Obama administration. And my last job in the Obama administration was as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Combating Terrorism, which unfortunately, given the nature of the work, requires a lot of work in the wider Middle East. And so that's why I hope people are interested in what I have to say.
I think that's great. And you're one of my, I love whenever guests is like, you shouldn't trust me, but, I'm providing a perspective, and it's up to you to take what I have to say with a grain of salt and do your own research and see that I am bringing a well thought out and a well experienced perspective to the table. So one of my favorite answers. So we covered this on the podcast last week, and obviously between the time that released that episode to this episode, the U.S. decided to bomb 3 different locations within Iran. And then there is a ceasefire that is holding on by what appears to be a thread, maybe a slightly thick thread, but still a thread. And there is a lot of different claims and arguments and perspectives coming out on how successful this mission was. You wrote an interesting article, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't want to completely paraphrase what you're saying, but basically applauding the Trump admin for conducting this strike and saying it was relatively necessary. I would love to hear more of your thoughts on that, because my past guest was pretty anti the U.S. engaging in any of that type of way. So please elaborate.
Sure. And I should say that the administrations that I served are Democratic administrations, very proudly. I'm a Democrat, but I try to make sure that as I'm thinking about the region, thinking about U.S. force, especially in the region, that that I'm trying to call it as I see it and not look through a political lens, but through a policy lens. And we can talk in the time that we have about how we got to this point, because there's a lot of stories of how we got to this point. But the question is, given that we got to this point, was this the right decision or the wrong decision for President Trump to strike Iran, and especially strike the Fordo facility, which, according to all the estimates that I've seen over the years, it was beyond the real capabilities of Israel to destroy. And none of these things are easy decisions, but my decision, my view is it was the right decision to do. If I was in the government, I would have been making that argument. I'll tell you why, because, and by the way, I should also say that for many years, I had the opposite view. For many, many years, not only did I feel fairly strongly that the United States shouldn't to take this action, but I actually found this to be a very boring topic because I was like, Israel can't and the United States won't. And so why are we still talking about this? This is a political discussion, not a policy discussion, because the policy is done. And the reason why was because the risks of doing so were far outweighed the potential benefits that we can do and the risks. But that has fundamentally changed. What's also fundamentally changed is the nature of the Iranian regime itself. The risks have gone down significantly because the potential retaliatory strikes from Iranian proxies and partners around the region is a much diminished compared to what it was. Hamas is a shadow of what it was. Hezbollah is severely weakened. The Assad regime in Syria, which was Iran's most important relationship, is gone, and Assad has fled to Moscow. The strategic air defenses in Iran that we were so worried about for a long period of time were completely eliminated by Israel. And in fact, there was complete air superiority with no possibility of U.S. Planes being shot down. So these were all the things that were long on the list of negatives of risks associated with of this strike. The other thing is that Iran has fundamentally changed. I'm old enough to remember since the 1979 Iranian Revolution. If you're talking to any Iranian diplomat, and I've talked to many, many over the years, and if you're talking to anybody who supports the Iranian regime, the first talking point that they had for decades was, our government has never attacked anyone. We are only attacked. We were attacked by Iraq. We were attacked by the United States, by President Carter when he tried to rescue the hostages. We are not attack. We don't attack people. And then you would say, well, what about your partners and proxies? And they would say, directly, we have never attacked anyone. They always said this. They threw that out the window last year when they decided to directly attack Israel, not once, but twice, with hundreds and hundreds of missiles and drones, with the intent of killing a great number of innocent people. The targeting innocence is not a unfortunate byproduct of what their actions are. It is their goal of what they do, and they have proven this over and over again. That is an extremely different Iran than it has been. It's also an Iran that has decided to become a military ally of Russia in its war against Ukraine. Again, this is something that was inconceivable not that long ago, and that's what they've done. So Iran has fundamentally changed its behavior to become much more dangerous than it was, and the risk side has gone down. And they've decided to accelerate their enrichment of uranium, despite the fact that the last two American presidencies, the last two American administrations, President Biden and President Trump, both came into office signaling in every possible way that not only did they want a nuclear deal, but they were desperate for a nuclear deal. President Biden put the most amiable official, Rob Malley, a person I know very, very well, a friend of mine in many respects, but somebody who I disagree with on lots of these issues. They put him in charge of the negotiations with Iran, again, sending the signal as loudly as possible. They wanted a deal. Iran decided that they weren't going to do those. They never even met with him directly. They didn't have a deal. So that was 4 years of the Biden administration. When the Trump administration came in, he refused to bring on any of the people associated with his maximum pressure campaign against Iran, the people who talked him into getting out of the nuclear deal when he came in his last administration, and send every message that he wanted a deal, that he was, and they didn't engage fulsomely there either. So this is the Iran that we're talking about, and the risks are much lower. And the reality is that unless there was another ace up their sleeve, Israel was not going to have the ability to take out Fordo. So if we didn't do it, again, not saying how we got there yet, but where we were. If we didn't do it, we were going to potentially be left in the worst possible outcome, which was a massive attack on the Iranian nuclear program from Israel that did not actually have the material effect that we were looking to of degrading their nuclear program, which would then most likely result in them declaring themselves a nuclear power, or at the very least be able to threat the entire region continuously of doing so. That's the worst case scenario. That's a scenario we had to avoid. The way that we avoided it is with a U.S. strike.
Although, based on the leaked intelligence from the Pentagon of the initial assessment, it does appear that that could be the case, where there was damage done, but it's not necessarily as significant in any way as the Trump admin is currently claiming, nor was intended.
Yeah, and we'll see. I don't put much stock in in off the cuff comments that top people in the Trump administration put to about BDA, about bomb damage assessment. I put more stock in DIA. That's a lot of a lot of experts that are doing this. I do think that it's unfortunate that people decided that they were going to leak it immediately to the government, because I have enough experience in these things to know how much these assessments can change on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis. The assessments, and I don't have any security clearances anymore, but I have experience in receiving these assessments, and and that kind of speed, most likely what they were looking at was overhead shots, overhead pictures of what they're doing, which is pretty hard to do when you're dealing with a very deep facility. Not impossible, but it's pretty hard to do. The other thing that you'd want to look at is intelligence of not, of course, what Iran is saying to the wider public, but what Iranians are saying to themselves, and that comes over time that they're doing that. So the jury is still out on this question, but it is entirely possible that they did not have 100% success. In fact, if DIA came out and said that they had 100% success, I would be more skeptical of this, because most of the planning for going against Fordo over the years don't involve one strike. It involves a campaign that would last for a number of days to do so. A campaign that would start with taking out the air defenses, which we didn't have to do. But how bombing campaigns usually work is you strike, you do a BDA, you figure out what you've missed, you strike again, you do a BDA. That's how militaries work. And the Trump administration has decided not to do that in this case, or at least thus far decided not to do that. So it's not that's the kind of thing that I would have, that if we're going to take this step, I would hope that we would have done, but it doesn't seem that that's what we're doing right now.
So you would want this to be continued further?
Well, the reason why it didn't, I said right after it happened, Donald Trump went out and said that he wanted to have a ceasefire. I didn't have any intelligence, but I said publicly, I will bet my house this is what has just happened, is that the regime in Tehran has come to the White House and has, through the channels that already exist, the indirect channels, and have said, we are now willing to meet directly with Steve Witkoff to talk about a wider agreement. Remember, that was something that they have done in the past, but they were always saying, oh, we want to have indirect talks. We want to do, but I believe that's what it smelled like to me from doing this. And the reason why is because both Iran and all Iranian proxies have like a standard diplomatic playbook. And that playbook is, when they're in a conflict, they ask for a ceasefire as a price to start the negotiations. That's what Hamas has done. That's what Hezbollah did. That's what the Houthis did. That's what they all do. Typically, the answer to that is, whether it's the United States or whether it's Israel or Iran, is no. We do not give a ceasefire in order to start negotiations. We do negotiations in order to get a ceasefire, and we're happy to talk whenever you want to talk. In this case, it didn't surprise me that Donald Trump went for that deal. That's what I suspect happened, is that he said, great, we're going to have a ceasefire because I want to have negotiations. So as I said, he came into office nearly begging for those negotiations. I think Iran is doing those negotiations because they're fundamentally weaker now. They're at the weakest point and they desperately need those negotiations. So then the question is, what happens when those negotiations take place? And we can talk about that if you like.
Right. So, there was a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different opinions on whether or not. So, obviously, Iran was enriching uranium up to 60%, 90% is needed for a nuclear weapon. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Uh, and I know that the Trump admin was for negotiations. The non starter was there's no need for them to be enriching uranium at all. They didn't want them to have a civilian program for any nuclear energy. Like there's to be no nuclear at all. And so we know that they had been enriching uranium up until this point, and they had violated some terms of agreement of the IEAE, right? I think.
Yeah, the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. But what you said is not, if I can just interrupt, it's not
Yeah,
exactly correct.
please.
In fact, nobody is saying that they can't have a civilian nuclear program. There are lots of countries in the world that have civilian nuclear programs and do no domestic enrichment whatsoever. They purchase enriched uranium through mechanisms that exist around the world in order to fund their civilian nuclear program, because that helps control. The Iranians decided a long time ago that they didn't want to do this, that they wanted to enrich their own uranium. Now, you might ask, why? What's the purpose? Right across the Gulf, the UAE has a civilian nuclear program. It's been there for a long time. It's under the non-proliferation treaty. They don't have nuclear weapons. There's no plan for nuclear weapons. Iran could have, from day one, said, I'm going to do exactly what the UAE is doing. They chose not to. And they chose not to because, which that's one of many pieces of evidence that, as people like us that have been watching this, right, like me that's watching like this, says, yes, they know not to because they want the option to go to create a nuclear weapon if they want to.
So do you think they were taking steps to create the nuclear weapon? Because I know that's up for debate among a lot of experts.
We know that they were taking steps. What's not up for debate, we know that they were taking steps to allow them to make the decision to make a nuclear weapon and to shorten the time between the decision to make a nuclear weapon and the possession of a nuclear weapon. So that it's one thing if they create their system. So if the supreme leader says, I want a nuclear weapon, then it takes years to do it. But he didn't want that either. He wanted a system where he could take mere months or mere weeks or even mere days. And there's lots of things that go into turning highly enriched uranium into a nuclear weapon. And he was taking a lot of those steps to allow those to happen. Now, one could argue, and you hear this on the other side, that there was no decision to make a nuclear weapon, and I have no evidence that there was any decision to make a nuclear weapon. And one could argue that, the decisions that were being made, we should minimize the seriousness of those to shorten the time frame. I see no reason for a whole, and frankly, nobody does, for the whole panoply of these decisions to be made, other than to be able to, put the entire region in an experience of fear and chaos, to basically blackmail the entire region, because you can go nuclear with a turn of a screw. That's what they wanted to do. And in fact, in terms of the strategic implications, that is almost equivalent to having a nuclear weapon. Because then what you've done is you've made incentives for everybody on the other side to have nuclear weapons. Remember, one of the reasons why we had this policy for a long time is not only to prevent a country like Iran, which is a malign actor in the region by any stretch of the imagination, but from being a nuclear power, but also to prevent a nuclear arms race amongst the other wealthy countries on the other side of the Gulf. If all of these countries have nuclear weapons, that's a much more unstable region over time. So we don't want them to be blackmailing the region. We don't want them to be threatening the region. It's almost just as bad as they're doing that. And again, anybody who who wants to give them the benefit of the doubt of their decision making has to start with the question of why did they decide twice last year to directly attack Israel, and what kind of country does that? Iran, what Iran has done very successfully over the last number of decades is to move up the escalation ladder slowly but surely. They get pushed back and then they go down and then they go back again to see if that was a one time. And what they're trying to do is create a new normal of accepted behavior, something that everyone says, oh, okay, this is just how it is, that advantages them. There is no other country in the world. I mean, it's important to really think about it. No other country in the world that gives precision weaponry to non-state actors and instructs those non-state actors to use that precision weaponry across international borders to intentionally target civilians. Nobody does this. But Iran does this so routinely that we've all come to accept it. It should be the headline in the New York Times every single day because it's so egregious in the world's in international relations. But they've successfully moved up the escalation ladder so often that we've come to accept it. It's become a normal. They wanted to establish a new normal that they could send hundreds of ballistic missiles into Israel anytime they wanted. That was what their goal was. They tried it and they fit and it rebounded very negatively on them.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but are you referring to the drone attack that happened when they launched like 100 drones?
It was 100 drones and ballistic missiles, both in April and in October. In April, they did it, and those would have caused a tremendous amount of damage, except for the work that the United States did, the Biden administration did, working with every other Arab country in the region to do integrated air defenses to shoot down a great number of the drones and the missiles, also abetted by Israel's domestic air defenses, their Iron Dome, their Arrow systems, and everything like that. And so it had very, very little effect in April. It had very little effect because of what we did, not because of what they did. The Biden
Wasn't
administration.
there a reason for them launching those drones though?
Yeah,
Because
because Israel struck an Iranian intelligence center inside of Syria that was being used through their proxies to attack Israel. So again, if what you've heard from Iran for a long time is this sort of like peculiar sense of symmetry that they have. This is the normal way of they like to say that they do only things that others do to them. But you saw it most recently when they struck. They did the performative action of striking at the U.S. Base in Qatar most recently. They made a point to say the exact same number of bombs were dropped as were dropped on us, or because they like this symmetry to be done. They broke this symmetry when again they were using proxies to attack Israel. They have been doing this for about a year, well, they're doing it for quite longer than that, doing it in a very active way since October 7th and October 8th. And then in April, they some of the people that were very much involved in this were attacked. If they wanted to do something symmetrical, right, they would have blown something up that Israel owned in another third country, right? Like that would have been the symmetrical thing to do. They chose not to do that. They chose to really not go up methodically up the escalation ladder, but to jump up the escalation ladder and to completely, again, throw their talking point out the window and for the first time ever, throw hundreds of projectiles. The Biden administration stopped it. And then the Biden administration got Israel to basically not respond to this, to take the win, as they said. What Tehran took from that was not strength, but weakness. And they said, see, we have now created the new normal. We can do this whenever we want. And so at another provocation in their mind that was done, they decided to do this again. At that point, the Israelis said, we are not going to take the win. We can't accept this as a new normal, that every single time that they want, they can just throw hundreds of missiles at us. And we're going to attack them. And they took out the strategic air defenses. And what I said at the time was the number one loser in that was, of course, Tehran. But the number two loser in that was every CENTCOM planner that I've talked to in decades, who would always tell us about the amount of losses that we would need to expect if we ever attack the vaunted air defense system of Iran. The amount of losses that Israel took was zero. So that was quite an impressive operation, something that we didn't expect, and I can bet money that the Iranians didn't expect others, but made it so that they were, at least at a strategic level, not a tactical level, but a strategic level, they were defenseless to a foreign air force.
I mean, you obviously have been doing this for years and you have an extensive knowledge and experience on multiple different levels with this. In this specific, we'll call it the 12-day war because that's what Trump admin has, labeled it as. It felt like it was initiated by Israel and Iran was responding. And then it felt like the US escalated it further. And that, and so from a civilian perspective, you're like, yeah, I don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons. Obviously not, you know. But it didn't feel like they were the instigator for the moment. It did feel like it was Israel as well as the US that were somewhat escalating and kind of flexing their muscle. And I feel like you feel differently, and so I would love to,
Well, I mean, not to be too snarky about it, but I do find it interesting that people who say that you can't look at October 7th and what Hamas did as an isolated case, and you have to look at the long history, are the same people that are saying, okay, let's look at just the Israeli strike on the Iranian nuclear program and pretend that there's no history to it. Like there's always a history to all of this. And as I said before, how we got there was an important case. It is the case 100% that Israel, for this last turn of the screw, that Israel instigated this. And so you have to ask yourself, why did Israel do this? And, the historians will find this out as in the decades to come. But here would be my educated guess right now, is they saw a window of opportunity in front of them that was generational in scope. Remember, there are a few entities that pose an existential threat to the state of Israel. Iran is at the top of that list. Not only does it pose it in terms of capability set, but it poses it in terms of objective. And you know this because they say it all the time. They say that they want to destroy Israel all the time. They say they want to make it to be wiped off the map. So this is not a theoretical discussion. This is a real world. This is a country that is dedicated to our destruction. And by the way, it's just this regime. For the prior regime wasn't dedicated. There's actually nothing there. Like any country in the world, Iran has national security interests. And if you were in charge of Iran, you would understand its national security interests. Israel actually doesn't even fit into those at all. Israel is not a strategic threat to Iran naturally. This regime, when it came into power in 1979, decided that Israel, for theocratic reasons, for more than anything else, was something that they had to organize themselves around combating, and that's what they've been doing ever since. So that's what Israel. That's the perception, and I believe the reality. They have been trying to deal with this reality for decades, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully. What October 7th showed them is that their previous plans of how to deal with them, which was basically managing the problem, completely failed. And that they weren't going to accept managing the problem anymore. They were going to have to eliminate capabilities of entities that were self-designed for their destruction. Hamas's goal is to destroy Israel. Hezbollah's goal is to destroy Israel. Iran's goal is to destroy Israel. And they were just say, if that's your goal, we're not going to give you the capability of doing that anymore. We're not going to just try to manage the problem. So that was their attitude. And they said, now we have an opportunity, a window open to achieve this goal, or at least make real progress towards this goal. And that window is going to close at some point. That's one thing. The second thing, and that's real, those are real national security. And frankly, I have great sympathy for that argument. There were two other reasons I suspect, and again, I don't know this, but I suspect. And these are less good reasons. One is domestic politics inside of Israel. If you look at Bibi Netanyahu, I may have great quibbles with him as a geostrategic thinker, but he is a master political domestic tactician, and he has been successful for decades and decades. And frankly, I've given up on trying to, I believe that Bibi Netanyahu is smarter at his domestic politics than I will ever be, and because he's proved this again and again. And he was having real hard problems if you're following Israeli domestic politics. And so I suspect that was something that also dealt with time. But the most important thing was actually what was happening in the United States. President Trump's the most transparent president that's ever been in my lifetime. And he was projecting as clearly as possible. He was desperate for a deal. And the worst case scenario from an Israeli strategic perspective is a bad deal that the United States signed up to, that President Trump signs up to, that a Republican president signs up to. That is a nightmare scenario for them. And that's what President Trump was broadcasting to the world. There was questioning, should we care about their enrichment? All these things were public out there. On top of that,
he just tweets. His thumbs are always active.
He's like, again, I say this to foreign leaders all the time. If you guys are confused about about the United States, you're really just not paying attention. You need to pay attention.
He has a thought, and it ends up on Truth Social immediately.
Right. He's very transparent. But that's what he was projecting. He was telling Israel publicly not to attack, right? Like not privately, not just privately, publicly. He was, and on top of that, all of the people, as I mentioned before, that were working with Israel very closely on the maximum pressure campaign against Iran in the first administration were not only not rehired, but were made personas non grata very publicly, about them. These were all the people that Israel was used to working with. They're like, oh, none of them are in this. There were some people that they could work with very well. And what happened just a short period of time before all of those people just got fired. National security guys that got fired, all these people so Israel just saw that the United States was positioning itself publicly and organizationally to do the kind of deal that would have been a disaster for them. So I suspect that when you look at what was happening in the United States, what was happening inside of Israel, and most importantly, the geostrategic environment, that's the dominant feature, the window of opportunity. That's what had them go. The Trump administration was entirely confused. They were confused to the world, and then because they were confused to themselves about this. If you look at what they were said right before, during, after, they were confused. And I've been an observer of Israeli-U.S. highest level conversations for quite a long time. Here's one truism. Here's how Israel interprets things based on their experience with multiple presidents. If a U.S. president gives them the red light, you cannot do X. It is really, really difficult. Not impossible, but it is really, really difficult for them to go the other way and to do that. If we say anything else other than the red light, that is interpreted as a
Let's go.
That's it. Doesn't matter what kind of caveats we put around it. I suspect that what Israel heard from Donald Trump was in that second category. And so they thought they had a green light for all
They
this.
gave him the 60 days and then they're like 60 days up. We're
Oh,
going in.
that's and so they thought they had it, and they said it publicly. Oh no, we've been coordinating
Yeah.
with the administration. Now, then Secretary of State Rubio and National Security Advisor Rubio put out a statement that night saying it was an amazing statement, terrible, that said like this was all just unilateral. We had nothing to do with this, which by the way, not too many people like believed, especially when Trump was speaking publicly and telling them not to do this, But he also then said, and I also want to be clear, the only thing that we really care about is the security of our people, overseas. It's like the security of Israel, the security of our friends and partners on the other side of the Gulf, our national security interests. None of these things were in that list. So that caused a lot of concerns amongst everyone that was watching this in the region. And then it looked like Israel was successful in its strike. And so then you saw Trump completely reverse himself and say, I love this strike. It's absolutely great. So the reason why it was confused externally is because it was confused internally. But then Trump looked at the situation. I suspect that there was a lot of the kind of analysis that I just said about what are the different scenarios of how this can end and how do we avoid the worst case scenario and maximize the probabilities of a better case scenario. And the better case scenario, again, are ones where at the end of the whole process, military and negotiations, Iran is not able to pose an existential threat to Israel or anybody else in the region. That is the goal right here. And he said, we're going to do this strike, at which point he got into a big public political fight with much of his MAGA base. And so it delayed it for a few days, but eventually he got control over that. Now the negotiations are going to start. We just saw that today.
They're meeting next week, I believe.
That's what President Trump said. They're going to meet next week. Be interesting to see if it's just Witkoff or it's Witkoff plus J.D. Vance. The purpose of J.D. Vance is not diplomatic. The purpose of J.D. Vance being there, if it happens, is political, so that he has cover on his MAGA base for what comes out of it. But the most important thing to understand about those negotiations is that they can only end in three ways. They could end with Supreme Leader blinking. They can end with Trump blinking, or they can end without a resolution. And so let's look at those three scenarios. The Supreme Leader blinking would mean that his representatives, the president, on the dotted line, signs an agreement that says we will not, we give up our right to enrich uranium domestically. If I was an advisor, not just because I think it's right, but if I was an advisor to the regime inside of Iran, I would be willing to take that. I wouldn't want to take that, but his predecessor, the first supreme leader in Iran, famously drank from what he called the poison chalice to have a peace deal that ended the Iraq-Iran war. They did that because they were at a point of weakness in all of this. They are now at the weakest position they've been in decades. I think the regime is looking at potentially existential questions about because they know that the average Iranian really dislikes this regime.
Yeah, not fans at all.
And every time they get an opportunity in any single way, they try to show that, publicly. If I was an advisor to the regime and a believer in the Islamic Republic, I would say this is what you need to work on, and you need to give up this, at least for a period of time. You need to give this up, because what you're going to get from giving that up is the removal of all the sanctions that were associated with the nuclear program. And you need the removal of all the sanctions to have the economy going so that we can overcome what is likely to be a period of turmoil inside the country where the population turns against you. That's the right thing for them to do from their perspective. It's also the right thing because this is what Donald Trump desperately wants. And so now they have a president of the United States, and a Republican president of the United States, who will make that kind of deal. The second option is that Trump blinks. And that means that it is, and the Iranians are very good negotiators, and they will be pushing this direction from day one. But if at the end of the day, Trump agrees to something below that level that says that, oh, you can still do enrichment kind of like you could do under the JCPOA. And you end up with something that's like a JCPOA 2, a nuclear deal 2, the same deal that, of course, he threw out the door in his first term. It won't be called that. There will be lots of different nuances, differences. If you tell me that that was my job as a diplomat to come up with that, I can come up with 5 different ideas right now about how you would design that whole thing. If that happens, me as an analyst, I would say Trump blinks. And I would say this is the taco trade all over. Trump always chickens out. And Trump retreated from a generational opportunity where Iran was weak to have a real strategic victory, and he's turned his use of military force to empower. He's failed to turn that military force into empowering his negotiations to achieve a great strategic victory. If that's the second option, I hope it's not, but we should anticipate that that is one of the options. What's one of the scenarios that come out? The third scenario is that they leave with no deal. If they leave with no deal, then what's going to happen is the European countries are going to do snapback under the UN Security Council resolution that enshrined the nuclear deal. That brings back all of the sanctions that were taken off in the nuclear deal. That has to happen by October. It means that the decisions need to be made, in July, August. So that's part of the reason why the window of opportunity, that gets into the tacticals about why Israel is doing this right now, is what's defining these things. The if that happens, then Israel's answer is going to be, we did a ceasefire in order to give Donald Trump the ability to negotiate in good faith with these guys. And once again, they decided not to do this. And there's no deal. So therefore, there's no ceasefire. And we are going to ensure 2 things. We're going to ensure that they never have a nuclear capability, which means we have complete air dominance. We're just going to be doing this for decades to come. Anytime that we see anything, we're going to blow it up. And by the way, what that means is anytime we see them building long-range radars, we're going to blow those up. And every time we see them bringing out a launch vehicle for missiles, we're going to blow that up. And we're just going to continue to do this the same way that we were fighting what they call the war in between the wars inside of Syria. They're going to now extend this to Iran. And kind of it's the flip side of what Iran really liked the fact that they were fighting a war against Israel, and they were fighting it to the last Lebanese or the last Syrian, and none of their guys. It wasn't happening on their soil. On this scenario, what Israel is doing is saying, no, now this is going to happen on your soil, and so that's what's going to happen in the third scenario. Again, if I was in the regime, I would say that's not a good scenario for me, and that's why I go to the first one.
That one sounds bad. Not.
This is why if you're Iran, you should say, I want the second scenario, but I should be willing to accept the first one.
Yeah.
If you're Trump, you should say, I should only accept the first scenario. But it's quite possible that we'll get to the third scenario.
All right. Well, hope that doesn't happen. And so want to wrap this up, but the last question I have, I mean, you have a lot of experience, especially with terrorism, right, and domestic concerns. When the U.S. bombed Iran, obviously, whatever comes out of the Iran government's mouth is generally like just horse shit, right? And they talk the talk, but they don't often walk the walk. But they said every American is now a target in the area, and every military, right? And there's now all these concerns about potential sleeper cells and, domestic in terrorism from Iranian sympathizers and against Americans, especially in America. What do you know about this? How concerned should we be?
It's a real concern. Again, this is the nature of the regime. If it wasn't for our law enforcement and intelligence operations, back when I was in government, they would have put a bomb in a restaurant in Washington, D.C. to kill the Saudi ambassador and kill or maim anyone that was around them in the restaurant. If it wasn't for good law enforcement in Europe, they would have put a bomb in the middle of an opposition rally inside of Paris. This is this is what they do. And again, the deaths of innocents is not collateral damage. It is the objective from their point of view. So so they will be trying to do this. They tend to have a long time horizon on these things. It means that our intelligence, our law enforcement has to be better. As with the typical challenge of terrorism is we can succeed 100 times, but if they succeed once, then they win, right? That's the problem. That's the strategic problem of terrorism. And this is why the problem of this Iranian regime has been around for a long time. But let me tell you, if they made a clear decision when they decided they had to respond to the U.S. strikes. The U.S. had crossed the Rubicon of striking directly into Iran. We were very careful in what we struck, but we crossed that Rubicon. They had to strike against Americans, but they did it in the most performative fashion that they possibly could to prevent the risk of war. And Qatar undoubtedly played a good role of being their co-actor in this performance, right?
Yeah, they
To
were
do
like,
all that.
"Okay." Yeah, Iran basically, like, called Qatar, and
Right,
they're like, "So we're gonna bomb you," and Qatar's like, "Great, let us get, the
right,
things to block them, let
right.
us know."
But the question is, you know, how much have they really learned? The most dangerous thing about that terrorist attack in Washington D.C. that was foiled was the fact that they thought it was a good idea. Like, if they blew up something in the middle of Georgetown, we would have attacked them directly. It would have been probably a minor attack and everything. And the fact that they didn't understand our escalation ladder is really, really concerning. And now they made smart decisions most recently by only attacking us. They could have attacked us in other places. They could have successfully attacked us. They could have attacked us more through proxies. They could have gone after shipping in the Persian Gulf. They could have gone. They could have closed the Strait of Hormuz. They could have gone after energy targets. Remember the one during the maximum pressure campaign that in the last Trump administration, they did attack shipping, but they put the limpet mines above the water. They put the limpet mines above the water line so that the ships didn't sink. And they did attack. They attacked Abqaiq, one of, if not the most important energy facility in the entire world, if you understand what it does. But the things that they blew up with their drones through proxies in a deniable fashion were things that they knew that the Saudis could replace or repair within single-digit days. Right near them were things that they know, because they know how to do oil as well, were things that would take months and months and would take it offline, and everybody's gas in America would shoot up in price and all that. So they can do all of these things. And they know what the response would be, because the response would be, and you've already started to see this a little. This is the thing I know we're getting to the end that I just want to leave you with. What should you expect with Israel? Well, Israel is taking out, obviously, the capabilities to threaten Israel. The next step for them to do are the things that, again, if we go into this world, if we're in that third scenario, right? The things that have the potential of dividing the regime further from the people, right? So symbols of the regime. These are not military targets, but these are symbolic. You already seen one. You saw that when Israel destroyed the prison that is the most hated institution for the average Iranian. It's where they're
Yes, and it's
probably
home to a lot of political prisoners.
right. No, it's and so they blew that up. It's those kinds of symbolic things that you should expect next. They've also Israel has attacked energy related targets, but they haven't attacked the targets. They've done the equivalent of taking out the gate and the private that's in front of the gate. It's a message that says we can take out what's behind the gate, but we chose not to this time. They could take out the energy grid and things where people are just living. Those are the kinds of things that you would expect next. And if that doesn't happen, and if that doesn't work, then they've already proven their capability to take out military leaders and leaders of the military nuclear program, the scientists. They haven't touched the political leadership yet. So that would be these are all in that third scenario, that's where you see this all going. That's why if I'm an advisor in Tehran, I would say, look, send your negotiators in, try to get the second scenario. But let me tell you, we're not leaving without a deal. And so if at the last minute we have to accept the first scenario, we're going to accept the first scenario.
Interesting.
I hope that's
Very
what
interesting.
happens.
So do, yeah. I would love for bombing to stop on any regard. I will say that, you know. So
But I understand that.
yeah,
I really deeply do, because violence, war, these are not things to be taken lightly. And not only because of the specific violence that's being done, but because when wars start, it's very, very hard to predict how wars end. Nobody at the beginning of World War I thought it would end with the Bolsheviks in power in Moscow. Like these are completely unpredictable dynamics that can go on. And when you get to these unpredictable dynamics, things can get a lot worse, as they did in Moscow back in 1919. So that's why I agree with you. But here's the big but. The reason why military force is used is because it is the best of the worst options. It is because the other options in the absence of military force are worse than the option of military force. And anybody who is concerned about the use of military force, frankly, in any context, and really cares about this, intellectual integrity requires them to also think about, okay, what is the alternative to not using force? And what are the risks associated with this? And how do I mitigate those risks? And if you haven't thought through that, then all you're doing is reacting emotionally to the situation and you're not reacting analytically. I'm not saying you are. I'm just saying that we all don't like the use of military force. Everyone that I know in the US military does not want to use military force. That's the purpose of the military, is to deter so that you don't have to use military force. But they also know that there are worse options and you have to be willing to use military force if the other options are worse. And that's where I think we were when Donald Trump made the decision to destroy or to attack Fordo.
also, just last thing, there was some rumors that a lot of the enriched uranium was moved out prior to the attack. Do you think there's any legitimacy to that?
Well, I mean, I think if I was running the Tehran, that's a sort of
What you would
semi-obvious
say?
thing to do.
Yeah,
And if I was running Iran right now, that is exactly, even if I didn't, that's the message that I would want to put out, right?
totally.
So there's every reason to expect that message would come out. The reality is, I have no idea. You have no idea. Nobody has any idea except for the people in Iran, a very small group of people in Iran who make those decisions and carry out those decisions, and people in really only, there's a few more countries that have the ability, but really the United States and Israel with the intelligence capabilities to understand what they're saying to each other. And we don't always get that right in our intelligence capabilities. So it's a real concern. And that's why these negotiations have to happen. That's why I'm happy that they're happening, because what you want is a deal to get rid of them. In the Obama administration was threatening to attack Assad because of his use of chemical weapons. So red line that President Obama
The red line that kept
established.
moving, 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 moving.
Yeah, and then he decided not to, and he was tremendously criticized for that. And by the way, there is a lot to criticize about how that happened or whatever. But then there was a deal that was done, a negotiated deal where Assad gave up his chemical weapons. Did he give up every single chemical weapon? Well, we know that he didn't, because he actually used them a little bit later. But he gave up. We took off the battlefield vastly more chemical weapons as a result of that negotiated deal than in even the most optimistic scenarios of a strike. That's the opportunity in front of the Trump administration right now. How can they use these negotiations to take off the battlefield vastly more highly enriched uranium, vastly more centrifuges, vastly more of the inherent capability than we ever would have done with military strikes? That should be the goal. the Trump administration should be as successful as the Obama administration was in the other case.
Well, William, this has been a very educational conversation. Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you. So, and thank you. And I'm your host, Emily Gross. We'll be back next week with another episode of Bureaucracy.